Today at the National Press Club, Peter Malinauskas, the freshly minted South Australian Premier, steered Labor to victory at last month's election after just one term of the Marshall Liberal government, an overwhelming state result ahead of a federal poll. Peter Malinauskas with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club in Canberra and today's Westpac address. My name is Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. State premiers have played a crucial and much more conspicuous role in running not just the country, but the national agenda in the past 3 years, thanks to a global pandemic. National Cabinet gave them a platform, and a new parochialism crept in often into our national discussions about borders being opened or closed, and about states asserting their rights and responsibilities to run their health and education systems. Our guest today comes in at what feels like the end of this particular chapter in national politics after convincingly winning an election fought heavily on health issues. Whoever wins the looming federal election, we seem set for a new chapter of national debate about where the country goes next. And Peter Malinauskas seems very keen to try to help to set that agenda. Please join me in welcoming the South Australian Premier to address us today.
Thank you very much, Laura, for your very warm welcome. Let me start by acknowledging the Deputy Premier of South Australia, my good friend Susan Close, and I thank Susan for not just her support, but also her extraordinary thought leadership in our policy development in the lead up to the election. To my great friend, Senator Penny Wong, I do sincerely hope, Penny, that you get the opportunity to serve our nation and its people in a new capacity as the next Minister for Foreign Affairs of Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and in joining you and paying respects to elders past and present, it is always good to be on Ngunnawal country. Let me tell you, one of the reasons I will work so hard to ensure that Anthony Albanese forms a federal Labor government this year, and one of the reasons I worked so hard to deliver a change of government in South Australia, is that we must have voice, treaty and truth. We are doing that now in South Australia. I know Prime Minister Morrison won't do it in Canberra. I know Albo will. But now as Premier, I am determined that South Australia will have a voice in the national discourse and a place on the national stage. And here today, I know that I speak for our state on what is quite literally one of our national stages. So again, I thank the National Press Club and your committee for the invitation to be here today. It says to me that you do take seriously your role as a forum for the full range of issues in our national life, not just as an outlet for the daily grind and the nightly froth. And there is a fair bit of those to go around. These are quintessentially interesting times in our national life. I imagine for those of you that have reported my mate, Dr. Jim Chalmers' address to your club yesterday, the Ukrainian President's address to Parliament last Thursday, Shane Warne's memorial last Wednesday, and by the way, what he did in Adelaide in December 2006, I will never forget. And then the federal budget last Tuesday, and then last Monday's Oscar ceremony and that slap that was heard around the world. The 18 days that have passed since the South Australian election must seem like several lifetimes. Fortunately, I'm not here to take you back down the time tunnel 2.5 whole weeks to the end of our successful campaign. I'm much more interested today, and I suspect you are too, in casting forward. Forward to the task of successfully governing Australia for the generation to come. If you observed our election with interest, even from a distance, you will know that one of the particular policy choices we put forward to South Australians on election day was very clear. Our plans to end the ambulance ramping crisis and invest in hospitals versus the former government's plan to build a brand new basketball stadium on North Terrace in our city. I'm sure you would have heard that even from here. But what I would emphasise to you today, though, is this. That particular policy choice was really just the hammer on a bell. the note we were sounding was something quite different. The same was true of the rest of our frankly ambitious policy agenda in jobs, education and training, renewable energy, public transport and wider democratic reform. Right across the board, these are vital measures for the practical advancement of our state. And people did hear that, but they also heard something more. Whenever I spoke, in all the advertising we ran, and I believe ringing clearly in the ears of voters on election day, was this note. My opponent wanted to talk about the next few months and years and even a bit of the past. I wanted to talk about the next generation. Let me tell you, you don't spend days of your campaign on 3- and 4-year-old preschool if you're just chasing a political return in 5 weeks' time. There just aren't that many prospective young parents thinking about preschool education for their unborn children. But it's a critical investment in the workforce of the 2040s and a critical investment in a fair and stable society in that decade as well. That's why I wanted a mandate for it. That's why we're going to do it. Nor do you take a ban on political donation from South Australian politics if you're just managing lobbies and stakeholders for a tight upcoming electoral contest. And no voter, literally no voter, raised that policy with me on election day. So this was hardly a populist flourish. But it's a vital democratic reform, not just to reassure voters that political decisions aren't influenced by political donations, but to actually make sure that is seen to be the case. I want that reassurance. So should you. This isn't only about restoring trust in democratic government, it is about restoring trustworthiness to democratic government. South Australians responded positively to the decision I took to take them seriously, to take the times seriously, and to talk seriously about what comes next. My government was elected by everyday families who have mortgages that will run into the years and decades ahead, who sit down and check their super balances at tax time, who think about what their plans are, who think about their own insurance policies and ponder about the jobs their kids will have in decades to come. These people do not regard planning for 10 or 20 years' time as a frivolous exercise. Quite the contrary. They are grateful, indeed relieved to learn that they're not the only ones and that someone in government is looking ahead just as they are. I'm sure the working journalists here today experience the same from your audiences. When your reporting treats them with respect, ideally that respect is returned. So today, I want to go beyond the here and now. So I'm not here to have a whinge about the GST. I'm not here to have a whinge about water. And I'm not here for a culture war about renewables. Just as I spent every day of that campaign talking about the next generation, I want to spend every day in government on the same project, including this one. So let's start with what we all know to be the case. As we stand today, the immediate challenge of our national policy is very obviously the cost of living pressures that have finally found their way again from kitchen table to cabinet table. Now, if I really thought the current crunch on family budgets was a short-term blip or a temporary dip, I'd be more than prepared to move on, as I rather suspect the current federal government hopes to do, judging by what you might politely call its one-off plans for short-term relief. But that would be to fundamentally misread the structural economic challenge that COVID hasn't just exposed, but also exacerbated. Cost of living pressures are not new. They have been an omnipresent problem that suddenly has got a lot worse. People who rely on work for their income have been squeezed, and they've been squeezed for a decade. It's unbearably common to speak about Australia's period of 30 years of economic growth from the 1991 recession to the COVID pandemic. I can't imagine how many times that has been said in this forum. But we've only had 20 years of wages growth. For people who rely on work for their income, the economic miracle stopped 10 years ago. So be clear, the cost of living crisis in Middle Australia had its origins in the past 10 years of public policy quite deliberately designed to flatten wages. Then the pandemic cut off global transport routes and kept workers home all over the world. And again, because of our position at the end of global supply chains, after many years of conscious policy that she would make fewer things that we use every day. So now we live in a country where you can't any longer manage a household with things that are made here at home. And now, of course, we have a petrol price shock. Hard enough back home in Adelaide. How other families in East Coast states do that long commute every day, I can't imagine. So we've got wage stagnation, high cost of manufactured goods, a global oil shock, and then there's the massive unequal wealth effect that the pandemic disruption has had to our economy. People who were fortunate enough to own assets at the start of the crisis, especially real estate, have had an extraordinary return on their investment through a period where other people who relied only on their labour for their income have experienced huge disruption and insecurity, which has ultimately resulted in an extraordinary hip pocket hit. Now, in that position, with an old problem growing for a decade, that's got a whole lot worse in the past 2 years, blowing up on the eve of a federal election, all of that creates a genuine national risk. What I fear is that we'll only have short-term solutions, one-offs, like a fuel tax holiday until September, or cash handouts this year. And they will come at the expense of long-term structural reform that addresses the long-term structural challenge that got us here in the first place. And what a challenge it is. Because, friends, if that summary of the immediate challenge to Australian governments isn't sobering enough, I put it to you that all that is actually just the symptom. Now I'm going to show you 3 slides. I know that no words sends fear through an audience like slides, but I promise I've never been a management consultant, and there are only 3. This is the Harvard Index for Economic Complexity. You see here depicted the German economy. The size of the boxes that you see, and there are lots I know, but the size of the boxes you see depict the value that that industry presents to the German economy in this case, as measured by its exports. So the size of the box is the size of the value to that economy. The colour of the box depicts economic complexity. Dark green reflects deeply complex, and the darker orangey colour represents relatively simple. Now this matters because complexity is an indicator of skilled work, secure work, well-paid work. Now it's hardly surprising that here in the German economy you see a lot of green and a large number of boxes. But if we move to the Canadian economy, you'll see that it's a bit different. You see less green and more simplicity in their economy. Now, the Canadian economy is a great comparator, I think, to Australia. We have things in common, not least of which our relative size of the economy. I think from memory, Canada is the 9th largest economy in the world. I think we're the 13th. Population a bit over 35 million, a population here at home approaching 27. Both nations very large, both blessed geographically and with a large abundance of natural resources. So it's not surprising that in the Canadian economy you see more orange and less green. But if we look at the Australian economy, we see a fundamentally different picture. A fundamentally different picture. I mean, I believe this to be a depiction that is quite extraordinary. So much less diverse, so much less complex, so reliant on commodities, so reliant on sectors which generate comparatively less skilled employment, even to Canada. Now, when you show this slide in some quarters, it creates a degree of shame or horror in the room. I don't share that view. Ultimately, this shouldn't be a source of shame. This is an economy that's been a source of an extraordinary living standard in our nation for decades. This has served us well, one of the highest GDP per capitas, and we still remain the envy of the world. So you might reasonably say, why is any of this a problem? Can't we just take the world's commodities money and all go to the races for the afternoon? Well, I'll give you 5 reasons why not. First, complexity is an indicator of demand for skilled, productive, secure, well-paid labour. Because our economy lacks complexity, we don't create enough highly skilled jobs. Mining trains hardly need drivers in the same volume they once did. We need to create demand for brain jobs, not just for our kids, but for 50-year-olds with 15 years in the workforce ahead of them. Second, diversity is an indicator of resilience against external shock. Our extraordinarily high level of dependence of national income on 2 or 3 resources, iron ore, coal and natural gas, means our national future for living standards and for public revenue is never truly in our own hands. Third, because those export-earning sectors don't create demand for the level of mass employment that we desire in our economy, the income earned from those exports doesn't flow far enough or fast enough into take-home pay packets for enough working Australians. The link between national income and household income in our nation is too weak. You've all heard Chris Richardson say in the past month that recently the world has given Australia a pay rise through rising commodity prices. True. But with an economy structured like ours, a pay rise for Australia isn't a pay rise for Australians. There's not no effect. Notably, our super balances benefit through strong returns. But national income growth is likely to be much less equal than in a more complex economy and have much less impact on broadly improving living standards. Fourth, we're more exposed to global supply chains than an economy which is more complex and diverse. We can all reel about Chinese state sanctions on beef and wine. And yes, we could eat our way through the crisis. Your chefs have delivered some marvellous patriotic servings in recent years, I know. But I rather suspect that if there was a fire in the kitchen this weekend, you'd be waiting for quite some time for the new things to arrive. And this reliance on imports, especially for new manufactured goods, creates pressures for everyone. For everyone. We're now importing virtually everything, including inflation. These 4 things are about our relatively simple economy. We don't create enough skilled jobs, too exposed to external demand shocks, not great at spreading the income through our society, and too exposed from importing inflation from overseas. None of this is new, but the 5th one has also been coming at us for a decade as well. Some of the yellow boxes on this slide here for Australia are going out of fashion, and they're going out of fashion hard and fast. Look at the ginormous box there for coal. It's like having your life savings in a hat manufacturer in 1945. We've got about 15 years to make the most of it. The world is eventually going to stop buying this stuff in a big way. And if we want a living for our own retirements, much less for our kids, we need to make the transition really, really soon. So what Australian government's going to do? We have lived, indeed, we are living through a health crisis. And of course, I have just fought an election that in many ways was a health election. As our people live longer, as our population grows, as the needs of healthcare, aged care, dental care, disability care grow each and every year, it is an essential agenda. I'll never lose sight of it. No government should. But be very clear. We face a generational economic question which can only have a generational educational answer. That's why in South Australia we have committed to investments in 3- and 4-year-old preschool that won't pay off in our economy for decades. That's why we've embraced a difference of opinion with teaching unions about the right of public school principals to hire. That's why we're embracing a reform of the university sector in our state that has suffered so much but needs change if it's ever to recover. That's why we're putting skills back into schools in a way not seen in my lifetime. State governments can make a very serious contribution to the national good. After the past 2 years, what I think of the central tier of Australia's 3 levels of governance has never looked more important. But we need a partner. I'll expand on one example. The universities have just been smashed by COVID. And even worse, they've been thoroughly ignored. And as that has happened, we know they really should be the engine room of economic enablement for individuals and for the national economy. There's no serious policy effort in the current federal government on higher education. There is just an inexplicable, irresponsible habit of intergenerational envy and campus politics legacy wars. As a Premier, I am prepared to do my bit. South Australia's 3 universities are governed by state acts. Every thinking person at home knows we need to at least examine having 2 universities, not 3. No one's done it. We're going to do it. And I really hope that we have a federal education minister who can see the opportunity that will create. Or consider another example. My New South Wales colleague, Premier Perrottet, addressed you in December last year. I have no idea why you went to Sydney to hear from him. But that's a matter for club members at your AGM. But anyway, Premier Perrottet ranged widely, and I paid particular attention to his remarks about the fragmented environment for early childhood learning. Now, I'm not going to get in the habit of quoting Premier Perrottet, but these words are worth repeating at some length. The Commonwealth funds childcare, the states regulate it, the states fund early childhood education in community and mobile preschools, but if it's long day care, it's mostly funded by the Commonwealth. The states run schools, the Commonwealth funds before and after school care, but independent schools, skills and vocational training, well, they're a mishmash mix of both. Now, I insist that this confusion can't be an excuse for inaction. The first 1,000 days are crucial to the brain and social development of every child. Nearly a quarter, try this stat on, nearly a quarter of South Australian 5-year-olds have started school behind the development milestones. Nearly the highest proportion of all states, so clearly we must do better. But that mishmash Premier Perrottet described is a real barrier to lifting standards, lifting achievement and making the best use of the additional resources that we are prepared to commit. Now, I've just not promised new investments. I've announced there will be a Royal Commission into early childhood education and care in my state. The fragmented policy, environment and the vital importance of success demands nothing less. These are just 2 of the combined measures of investment and reform that can build productive capacity, then expand demand for skilled work, and which can begin to build the future that we all seek, to grow skills, to embed knowledge, to embrace complexity, to hedge against more of the national risk, to spread more of the national growth, to harness so much more of our national strengths. None of it will cut the cost of petrol or bread or beer next week. But my contention is that the only real way to address cost of living in the long term is to fundamentally change the third slide, to have a diverse and growing knowledge-rich economy with a sustainable wages and incomes policy based on lifting labour productivity. Wages and income is an area where the Commonwealth simply must lead. That is the great social and economic bargain at the heart of any good economy. Work better, earn more. And it is a bargain which has been absolutely abrogated in the political economy today. While the key policy areas that would deliver on the productivity end of the bargain, schools, higher education, training, skills development, early childhood, and where the territories and states are desperate for a partner in the federal government, it's long time past to begin. If you leave with one thought today, let it be this: we have to train up hard and fast to transform our people's skills and expand growing industries faster while the window is still open, before the world stops buying our big resources, while those big blank yellow boxes still exist at all. Next year's 3-year-old preschoolers will get their trade or finish their degree in the 2040s on the eve of a net zero carbon emissions world. It will be a time of enormous transformation in the global economy. I'm from Adelaide. I've been around while a whole industry sector disappears. It's not much fun. You need time to get ready. You need big investments in skills for workers young and old. You need governments, state and federal, on your side. We didn't have that. There's no point going it over now again, but we cannot let it happen again. So there's a fair bit to be going on with. I said I won't stop talking and thinking about the long-term future now that the campaign is over, and I won't. As I look at the agenda I bring to government in South Australia, one thing is very clear to me. I cannot recommend highly enough the practice of 4-year electoral terms. We have plenty to do as a federation. And while I won't talk as much about my own story today as I did when I was introducing myself to fellow South Australians, I won't stop entirely. Because the note I try to always strike is the future of our next generation, it's also so that when I reflect on the story of a generation past, that I think I can best share why that means so much to my government and to me. Some of you may well know that my personal story as an Australian is one that has a history of refugee resettlement. My remarkable paternal grandparents who settled here after the Second World War, they arrived in the Australia of Chifley and the South Australia of Playford in a nation-building era. That period is a golden one in the life of my family, and it's a golden one in the life of our nation. A period of recovery and reconstruction, and a period of refugee resettlement, of leaders whose vision was bold and generous, of a nation which built and a people who gave. My friend Tony Burke likes to quote T.S. Eliot and refer to this part of Canberra as a place where the echoes inhabit the garden. One of the small satisfactions of joining you here on the national circuit today is knowing that a few blocks west are the rooms where Chifley himself spent so many of his evenings, including his last. And a little further along the road, that marvellous democratic statue of Chifley and Curtin walking to work at Parliament House. I won't retell my paternal grandparents' remarkable saga here today. Suffice to say, they came a long way and came through a great deal to find sanctuary in our great nation.
Australia gave them a great deal, and they gave back everything they could. That is why it was such a remarkable half hour of our lives that my wife, Annabel, and I spent on election day queuing to vote with the Al-Kahali family. I think about the next generation, and then I think about what that family will give to our country over the next 20 years. It is just immense, and every family like them. We are mad not to bring many, many more people like the Al-Kahalis here to Australia. Good people who love democracy, people who embrace work, people who want to build a nation, people who want to give something back. We should follow the nation-building examples set by leaders like Chifley, Fraser and Hawke, and show the world our compassion, our commitment to the democratic project by welcoming Afghans and Ukrainians just as we did those from Central Europe post-World War II, the Vietnamese post the fall of Saigon, and the Chinese after Tiananmen Square. We welcomed these new Australians not because we needed fruit picked or cheap labour, but because it is something a confident, proud democracy does. We can and must do more. Just as much as the human and economic future of the next generation will be defined by the things we teach in our preschools in 5 years' time, it can also be defined by the marvellous people who settle here in the next 5 years. Whether they have fled Vilnius, Aleppo or Kiev or Kabul, there will be some beautiful stories and remarkable Aussies with us for the next generation. I hope there are many more, many more. They'll be very welcome in South Australia, and I commit that my government will punch above its weight within the Federation on that score. I hope to see them and their children living and working and learning alongside people whose families have been here 10 generations, and alongside people whose families have been here thousands of generations. Among a people who give me such determination to govern well and who give me such confidence that it is worth the work. So we look forward to that task of governing, and I look forward to the conversation with you today. I'm sure it is only just the beginning of a long and productive discussion between us in the coming years ahead about my state, about our country, and about the things that we can do to make them both so much stronger and fairer for the generation to come. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Premier. You've made a lot of really interesting points at this particular time of the national discussion. If I could take you up on the points about wages and incomes on the one side and productivity on the other. As you say, we've got a pay rise from the world, but it's not spread equally. You're a big employer as a state government. What would you like to see happen to our wages and incomes policy? I mean, it seems like the system is broken, the enterprise bargaining system has basically become broken. Do we need to have a national discussion in which state governments take a part about the structure of our wages and incomes structures, like the Fair Work Commission? And on the productivity side, can you see yourself having a joint ticket with Premier Perrottet in a forum like the National Cabinet to get various functions like childcare, after-school care and all those things split up differently with the federal government in the future?
Well, I'll start with the last part of your question first. Thank you, Laura. Look, I will be working with all my state premier colleagues, whether it be the National Cabinet or in other forums. We do need federation reform. I think we've talked about it a lot, but we haven't seen much action. Naturally, the National Cabinet presents a different mechanism to have that discussion, and I hope that translates into a national debate about our federation post the pandemic as we come out of that emergency. And I look forward to working with Premier Perrottet or his successor, Chris Minns, if there's a change of government there in the not too distant future. In respect to national wages and incomes policy, I do want to see a serious debate about this on the national stage. There are things that state governments can do, and I think state governments have the unique position of being the deliverer of education, of those services, to be able to set us up for the long term. And that's got a really important role to play, as I sought to cover in my speech. But there's an immediate need here as well about a national pay rise for ordinary people, and that's a discussion that principally has to be led not just through IR policy, but led through a national debate about what is fair. I have seen that completely lost for the last 10 years. There hasn't been much evidence, to the best of my recollection, of a commitment to even start that discussion. It seems to be more of a debate around a deliberate policy to suppress that discussion. And I think that's a massive missed opportunity. And the thing about a pay rise, it's not just about a fairer, more stable society, it's about genuine economic policy as well. But if I just invite people for one moment to cast your minds back to what we were talking about globally before the pandemic, it was mass political disruption in liberal democracies throughout the Western world. Trump, Eastern Europe, rise of Macron, Brexit, we had 5 prime ministers in 5 years here. That disruption in liberal democracy globally, I assert, was underpinned by that frustration in Western economies that a lot of people are being left behind. So this is part of a serious political economy discussion. It's about a fairness discussion, but it's also about what a strong economy really looks like.
Sarah Eisen.
Sarah Eisen from The Australian. Since your party came into government, there has been a lot of questions about the GST.
Yep.
If I could ask, have you spoken to Anthony Albanese or Jim Chalmers about any changes to the GST deal? And if so, where did that land? If not, will you do so before the election?
Oh, look, there's been loose discussions that I've raised with a number of my Labor colleagues on numerous occasions. I speak to Jim on a semi-frequent basis, similarly with Albo, and they're well aware that I am concerned that the GST deal that the Commonwealth led, that gave Western Australia a massive leg up so they can have a multi-billion-dollar surplus, was at the expense of a lot of other states, including my own. They're aware of my view about this. I will absolutely continue to agitate this. I'm well familiar with the fact that Jim yesterday ruled out changes, and that's his prerogative. But my prerogative, as the leader of my state, is to stand up to the Commonwealth, whether it be the coalition in charge or federal Labor, to advocate a case of fairness. I can't see any rational justification for the change that was made, apart from a political concern in the West that Scott Morrison had when he was the Treasurer. And what Premier McGowan and Premier Bartlett before him demonstrated was that they could use the power of politics to give their state a better deal. Well, I intend to do the same for South Australia.
Did it concern you how much Jim categorically ruled out reopening the deal?
No, because it reminds me exactly how much the Commonwealth Government used to categorically ruling something out for Western Australia too. So we're at the beginning of a journey here, and it's one I intend to pursue.
Thank you.
Gabriel Polychronis.
Gabriel Polychronis from the Adelaide Advertiser.
Good to see you, Gab.
Commiserations for Friday night's showdown.
Yeah, I'm still feeling it, mate. Thanks for raising it.
Premier, your emphatic state election victory last month proved the power of incumbency during the COVID pandemic is over, and it surely sent a very clear warning signal to the federal government. However, it has been remarked that opposition leader Anthony Albanese is no Peter Malinauskas. What advice would you give Anthony Albanese ahead of the federal election? And also, could you ever imagine yourself in federal politics in the future?
Look, the short, absolutely not. I made a very deliberate decision some time ago to put my hand up to represent the people of my state in state politics, and I have not regretted that decision for one moment, so I can rule that out. In respect to advice for Albo, Albo doesn't need advice from me. I mean, Anthony Albanese is one of the most experienced leaders that our country has ever had. He will bring an extraordinary degree of experience to the Prime Ministership, which I desperately hope he's able to succeed at achieving in potentially in a few weeks' time. Albo's got a record of delivery for the people of Australia in major economic portfolios, and he doesn't need advice from me, and I wish him all the very best in in a few weeks' time.
Tom McElroy.
Thanks for your speech, Premier. Tom McElroy from the Financial Review. You've said that South Australia is getting a dud deal on the GST carve-up.
Yeah.
Will your conversations with the next government, be it Labor or Liberal, include changes to the rate and base of the GST, which everyone acknowledges outside of elections is problematic? You've previously criticised your predecessor, Stephen Marshall, for not standing up to the federal government. Is this an issue you'll take up with the next?
Look, the rate and base isn't something that I intend to pursue. That's a matter that really needs to occur at a different time if we ever see a genuine debate about national tax reform. What I want to see is a debate about the carve-up. And like I said earlier, I intend to agitate that issue squarely and firmly with the Commonwealth, regardless of who's in charge.
When is the time for national debate about tax reform more substantially than just the carve-up?
Oh, look, I think we've got to contemplate all necessary reform all the time. I mean, I don't know why we'd be ruling things out at this critical juncture. I mean, we haven't experienced a moment like this in our nation since 1945. I mean, the last time that we had a global shock upend the way we think about things was World War II. Now, I'm reluctant to draw comparisons between World War II and the pandemic because they're very different things, but we haven't had a moment like this one since 1945 Australia. And I referred in my remarks earlier to Playford and Chifley. I mean, these were giants. These are giants of both their respective political parties who saw the fact that the electorate was yearning for a bit of vision. They knew that the sacrifices that were paid in World War II were necessary, but they also had an optimism that it was going to translate to a better future. And we've got that exact same moment now. Think of the thousands of businesses that willingly closed their doors in the pandemic, not knowing what was happening next. Think of all the workers that gave up their incomes, not in their interest, but in the interest of others. These are people who have made big sacrifices during the course of the pandemic. And as we graduate, hopefully, out of the worst of the pandemic, people want to know, what is the legacy of COVID going to be? You know, is it going to be more of the same, just going back to where we were before, wage stagnation and a less fair economy? Incredibly tumultuous state of affairs in our politics? Or is it actually going to be a legacy that is a better future? And that means there is an appetite, in my assessment, an appetite for ambition and boldness in policy, a vision for the future of the country. And I contend to you there's only one side of federal politics that seems to have any of that at the moment. And I don't know what Scott Morrison's plan is for the future, and I'm paying attention. And I'm not seeking to make a cheap political point here. I genuinely don't know what their vision for the future is. Whereas you look at Albo's plans and federal Labor's plans, there is a boldness there, there is an ambition there. Massive childcare reform, massive housing investment, including in public housing, investment in education and skills, 400,000 free TAFE places, 20,000 additional university places. That's starting to look like a serious national agenda that reflects the times. So the simple remark I make is that don't underestimate the yearning for the electorate in this moment to see the moment and then seize the moment. And that's what I sought to achieve at a state level. I know that federal Labor is seeking to achieve at a federal level.
Rachel Baxter.
Thanks, Premier. Rachel Baxter from the Nine Network. South Australia has a large defence industry. How do you feel about Nick Xenophon's bid to return to politics and represent the state on a federal level, given his former connection with the Chinese tech giant Huawei?
Look, Nick Xenophon has always espoused being a politician associated with transparency. Yet I don't see too much transparency around what his personal financial arrangements were with Huawei. So that's for him to answer. What I'd say about his candidacy again, is that I don't know if the times suit the Xenophon style. I mean, I don't know if people want stunts more than solutions. I don't know if they want politics more than policy, and I don't know if that suits Mr. Xenophon. He's got a degree of notoriety in South Australia, and he's been around for a while, a long time now, and I acknowledge his service in the past, but I don't think it's what people are looking for in the future. And, not too similar to my earlier remarks, what's his policy that he's running on? What's the platform here? I don't really know. So it strikes me that Xenophon's moment in the sun is well and truly past.
Do you think that the connection, though, with the Chinese company is a national security concern?
Well, I think Xenophon should be transparent about it. And I don't see much transparency, which he's supposed to be the epitome of. So, look, only Mr Xenophon can answer those questions. I think he owes it to the Australian people and the South Australian people to answer those questions, and I haven't seen much evidence of that thus far.
Pablo Vinales.
Thank you. Pablo Vinales, SBS World News. You spoke about welcoming more refugees, namely Afghans and Ukrainians, and the South Australian government punching above its weight.
Yeah.
Currently, the refugee intake annually is 13,750. What increase would you like to see, and what commitment could you see the South Australian government committing to?
Okay. So let's put the current 13,000 in a bit of context. So post-World War II, in the period of, I think it was 6 or 7 years, displaced people was just shy of 200,000. And that was in a far smaller Australia. Think about the Vietnamese resettlement. I mean, there are over 100,000 people who came to our nation post the fall of Saigon. I mean, that is an extraordinary number of people. Now compare that to the 13,000 today. I mean, come on. Now, I don't want to put a specific number on it, but I'm very comfortable with asserting that 13,000 in a nation like ours, in a time like these, strikes me as being very unambitious. And we're talking about the need for skilled migration to start up again. So we're talking about migration starting up again to achieve an economic objective. That's a legitimate debate to be had. But let's not miss out on the opportunity to do something just as powerful, just as great when it comes to the humanitarian visa program. Now, in terms of South Australia, I would like to see South Australia by a number of percentage points going above our national share. And I've already engaged our Department of Human Services to work out exactly what our capacity would be to take in a number of people very, very quickly. But it's got to be done as a partnership with the Commonwealth. And I see a lot of state governments who'd be willing to do that. I would want to be a serious leader in this regard.
So nationally, though, tens of thousands? I know you don't want to put a figure on it. But...
Well, like I said, 13,000 in comparison to over 100,000 post-Vietnam, almost 200,000 post-World War II. We can do a lot better than that.
Proportionally, you're talking about doubling or tripling be easily achieved?
Yeah, I think so, yes. Well, not I think so, I know so. Well, 13,000.
Bit of a famous line these days.
Yeah, is it? I'll avoid it. But if we can't at least double it, I think that would be a source of a lack of national pride and contextual understanding of exactly who we are as a country and what our values are.
Rob Scott.
Rob Scott from the Seven Network. Thank you very much for your speech. I was just wanting to ask you, you fought your campaign primarily on health issues. So what do you say to those people in South Australia today questioning your priorities, coming here to deliver your speech, however good it was, when your state is in the midst of a COVID health crisis and you're desperately trying to find extra hospital beds?
Well, I think health needs to be a debate we have on the national stage. And part of the challenge that we've got in healthcare, not just in South Australia, but around the nation at the moment, is the lack of integrated policy between primary healthcare service delivery and the way we look after people in hospitals. Those two systems not only not talk to each other, but actually on occasion work actively against each other. We've got to make sure that our primary healthcare system is functioning as well as our hospital system and they actually engage. So having the opportunity to be able to contribute to this important debate on the national stage is fundamentally in my state's interests. But this isn't a South Australian exclusive problem. This is a problem that exists throughout the nation. Now, Premier Andrews and Premier Perrottet are agitating about 50-50 funding reform to the National Health Agreement. That's something that I look forward to lending my voice to. But I also think we need to contemplate this issue of the intersection between primary health care and public health care as well.
Thank you.
Doesn't the pandemic, we weren't in Adelaide for your campaign, but doesn't the pandemic suggest that we do need a once-off step up in the funding of the health system?
Yes. So I'm doing it at a state level, 50-50 between the states and the Commonwealth at a national level. In terms of hospital funding, I think would make a dramatic improvement. The AMA were in South Australia during the course of our campaign, seeking a commitment from us in a policy sense that if that 50-50 ambition was realised, that would actually use the money for health rather than just pocketing it in state treasury. I provided that commitment. But absolutely, Laura, and people have reflected upon the crisis in hospitals throughout the country. It's a national problem. I don't think it's going away. The population is ageing. And in terms of that primary health care intersection with hospital care example, aged care is a central element of that. We have so many repeat customers, people coming out of aged care, coming to our hospitals, getting discharged, then coming back again because we're not doing aged care properly, which is why Federal Labor's policy announcement at the budget and reply speech the other day was sorely welcome from any thoughtful person who understands the depth of the crisis in our hospitals at the moment.
Nick Stewart.
Thanks for a brilliant exposition of how to gain government. You do it in one of two ways. You either come up with new policies, as you have, you've articulated them, you've stood for something different, and you've said, we are proud to be, you've provided something visionary. Otherwise, you try and slip in quietly, get by without, for example, threatening to change the GST between states, raise it. You just keep everything down and make it an issue that isn't a transactional cost for the voter. What is there that you would say has made you different from, for example, your Labor federal politics, who aren't going to suddenly double the number of double the refugee intake, unless I'm incorrect? That sort of thing isn't going to happen. So why do you think you have chosen your way to get into office, and Anthony Albanese has chosen his way?
Well, I thank you for the question and the kind remarks, but I would politely disagree with that assessment about different approaches. I see absolute similarity, if not mirroring, of approaches between federal Labor and what we've done in the recent state election. Look, Albo knows the significance of the moment, just as my team did. And like I said earlier, look at some of the policy. I mean, one I didn't mention is a $10 billion investment in housing. I mean, that's a big number. That's a number we haven't seen. That's a commitment to public housing that we haven't seen at the Commonwealth for decades. That's a seriously ambitious policy. Now, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, in the midst of the disintegration of harmony within the federal coalition, those sorts of policy announcements might not be getting the kudos and attention that I believe they deserve, but they are there. And what you've got is more than just a policy, but a highly capable team of delivering it that is united, right? So, I mean, the contrast couldn't be more stark between the coalition and federal Labor, just as I don't think it was more stark here in South Australia. That's why I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll see a change of government at the federal election. But we can't, presume to know what the Australian electorate will decide. And the only thing that can provide you the best guarantee of victory is hard work. And I don't think anyone's questioning federal Labor, particularly Anthony Albanese's work ethic.
Julie Hare.
Thank you so much for your speech. My name is Julie Hare. I'm from the Financial Review and also Director on the National Press Club. You've set up a commission to look at the possible merger of 2 or maybe 3 of your state's universities, yes, which you mentioned in your speech. Mergers in South Australia and also Western Australia come onto the agenda on a regular basis. Yes. I'm wondering whether you could explain to us why a top 100 university, which is the reason why I assume you're doing this, would help you achieve your vision of generational change and well-being. Yeah. It's a double-barrel question. Sorry, Laura. It's okay. Secondly, while on the topic of education, last week 6 of the Labor state and territory schools ministers made public a letter to National Schools Minister Stuart Robert about the National Schools Agreement. Could you explain to me the circumstances leading to that letter being made public, and whether you could see Labor ministers working as a bloc in the future, especially if the coalition is re-elected?
Well, South Australia was a signatory to that letter,
Yep.
and naturally that was brought through our cabinet process before the new minister signed it. How it became public, well, I don't know. You got 8 ministers signing it, so in respect to the university amalgamation. So, for those of you that might not be familiar with this debate in South Australia, it's been talked about a lot, as you obviously know, and it's always a can that seems to get kicked down the road, and it was so close to being achieved previously and then subsequently fell away in the last term of government. And I believe that governments have a seat at the table on this question. Now, why? Well, we don't have a top 100 university in South Australia, which was a position that we always held. Now, our international rankings have been improving from Adelaide University, which I'm very grateful is represented here today, but similarly Uni of SA and Flinders. They're great institutions, but they've evolved over time as completely autonomous organisations that sometimes work with each other, other times they don't. And I simply want to ask the question, if we were to start higher education all over again in South Australia, would we end up with 3 universities doing 3 very different things, or sometimes doing the exact same thing at the expense of efficient investment? More than that, when it comes to R&D funding, size does matter. And we know that South Australia is punching below its weight in that regard. And research and development, of course, we talk about being important to the national economy, but we don't see much policy effort to increase it. Now, I don't know how many levers we have for that at a state level, but clearly university policy is central to it. But every family's story these days has often been emboldened by the opportunity of higher education. We've seen a lot of reform of this sector in Australia in the past, but the most recent set of reforms seem to be at the expense of the sector rather than the emboldenment of it. There is absolutely no doubt that I would not be here today if my family didn't have the benefit, when I say over the last 2 or 3 generations, the benefit of getting access to a decent, better standard of living because of the role that education plays within our society. So progress is necessary. I think university amalgamation can help deliver that. I don't guarantee it'll happen because we're not going to do it belligerently, but we are going to do it cooperatively, and we're not afraid to provide leadership to achieve it.
Thank you.
Tim Shaw.
Thanks, Laura. Premier Tim Shaw, Director of the National Press Club. You and Dominic Perrottet have a lot in common. You're both millennials, you're both premiers, and you've both got young families. You've got 3 children, he's got 7.
Yeah, that's a big difference, Tim.
Big difference. So there's a bit of work to do there, Premier. But look, I just want to know, it's a live topic around your kitchen table as it was around Dom Perrottet's table about early childcare and education. Yep. I asked him in Sydney about his position regarding public and corporate spaces in childcare, and particularly too the use of state government-owned assets like public and primary school facilities to be able to create that integrated learning process. So you've talked a lot about the future of education in the state of South Australia. What's your view on that? Do you see that there must be that availability of publicly supported childcare spaces and also early education?
I think all options should be put on the table, and that's why we're having a Royal Commission to examine every last possible opportunity. Clearly, we've got the coalescence of both public and private operating at the moment. That is likely to continue into the future. But
do you see that as a major pressure for those families you referred to today that just can't afford that?
Absolutely.
What are you going to do about it?
All right, well, like I said, we're going to have a Royal Commission, and the Royal Commission, though, is there to provide us with the policy to achieve 3-year-old preschool by the end of this term of government. Now, that's not without its ambition and complexity, which is, well, why have the Royal Commission? Well, rather than having the Royal Commission to examine everything we've got wrong 5 years down the track, we'd rather have the Royal Commission at the front for once to actually work out how to get something right. But let's just put some things in context here. So people might be aware of the Program for International Student Assessment. That's an internationally recognised measure of school-age performance, as a country, we are going backwards, not relative just to the rest of the world, but relative to ourselves 15 years ago. So on average, kids going to school today are getting a worse school on average performance from school than what they were if they went to school 15 years ago. That is our collective legacy as a nation to the next generation. Now, why this isn't on the front page of paper every single day, why Prime Minister Morrison isn't getting asked about it every single day is beyond me. Now, if you look at all the international research about what can drive change, they say if you're going to put more money in, do it in the early years. It's almost academics begging and experts begging for that to be the policy approach. Now, how are we travelling as a nation on that score? So the OECD average for investment in early childhood education is about 0.6% of GDP. In Australia, we're at 0.2%. So in the OECD, on average, they're spending 3 times what we are on the early years in education. Our participation in terms of 3 and 4-year-old preschool as a nation hovers at around about 15%. The OECD average is well over 50%. We're like 3rd or 4th to the bottom in the OECD. Right? So at some point, we've got to say to ourselves as a country, look, well, we don't just love our kids, we're actually going to translate that love into an investment into them so they can enjoy the standard of living that we're lucky enough to enjoy, or hopefully one better than that. And that's why we're so serious about 3-year preschool. But you've got states, you've got the Commonwealth, you've got private providers, you've got the Catholic system. It's a complete mishmash, as Premier Perrottet referred to, and we want to make sure we get the policy right in terms of its delivery, but that may well result in a call on the Commonwealth, which is why we need a partner. And I hope Australians give us one in a few weeks' time.
Well, we've got about 5 more minutes, and you'll also be all very relieved to know that the Prime Minister has said he's not calling an election tomorrow, so that puts us all at our ease to discuss these big issues.
For that, I thank him.
The next question is from Mrs. Schubert.
Thank you for your speech, Premier. Misha Schubert here today as a Vice President of the National Press Club Board. I should also disclose that I'm the CEO of Science and Technology Australia in the context of asking this question, and also a South Australian export. Yes, so good. I wanted to ask you about the part of your speech where you talked about that picture of the complexity of the German economy and an aspiration for Australia to transition into a more complex economy. Germany's obviously done that by setting out a vision to become a technological powerhouse, and out of its sort of deep investment in research and technology to really drive that complexity. So can you give us the next layer of detail of your vision for the kinds of industries and sectors and aspirations Australia should hold around turning our economy from more of the orange into the green?
Okay, so let me maybe give you some examples of specific industries. Clearly, defence and space are close to my heart as a South Australian, an area of policy pursuit and reform that has been pursued across governments of both political persuasions. It's been with us for some time and it enjoys bipartisan support. Premier Marshall before me was serious about being bipartisan on this issue, and I maintain that position and hope that the next Leader of Opposition in South Australia can do the same. We have a challenge though in terms of skills at the moment. That is the biggest issue when it comes to that industry, particularly as we look down the pipeline of naval shipbuilding work. I could have a fair bit to say about that, but it maybe takes us in a different direction. Another industry I would point to is the hydrogen industry. Hydrogen is the fuel of the future. I don't think that's a coin toss anymore. I think there is enough evidence out there to suggest that hydrogen is going to be a fuel of the future. And unlike almost any other jurisdiction in the world, Australia, and I say more specifically South Australia, is capable of producing green hydrogen on a large scale. Now that industry alone and the export of it has the power to do what big mining has done in the past. And we've got to be investing in it hard because this is a race, it is on. We see the Germans, for instance, investing billions into hydrogen, but they're as interested in the consumption of it as much as they are the production and the technology around it. So I point to those as just 2 examples, but this is going to require an awful lot of R&D. The export of hydrogen needs a lot more work to make sure that we can do it in the form of ammonia or whatever it might be. And that's why engagement between universities and private investment and public investment needs to be invested in far more readily, not just in terms of dollars, but also thoughtful reform as well.
Sarah Ison has a question.
Hi again, Sarah Ison from The Australian. Your whole speech and a lot of your answers to our questions have been really big picture, and really ambitious.
Well, it's the National Press Club.
It's the National Press Club. Well done, yes. But in 2019, Labor lost an election, and following a review and so on, there were points about, having so much ambition and a huge policy agenda and so on. Are you concerned that that has scared off a federal Labor government or federal governments from being too ambitious in this way? And do you think Labor could go bigger with some of its policies?
No, because like I keep saying, look at their agenda. I mean, people try and characterise it as small target. I don't think it's small target at all. I think it's smart policy, it's thoughtful policy, and I think it reflects the times. Do you know, something that interests me throughout I've never been a leader of a party during an election before, and it gives you a whole new perspective, and it's an intense environment. You read a lot and you see what people are saying, and it always seems to be an effort or a gravitation towards comparing this election to another one in history. Yeah. Right? Is this a Rudd election, or is this more of an 04 Latham election, or is this the 19 election? Everyone wants to compare it to it. They're all different. And this one has never been more different, because never before have we had a federal election coming on the back of a global pandemic that has changed everybody's lives. So the idea that we should be thinking about the 2022 federal election in the context of the 19 election, I think it's a bit simple. And what I see is federal Labor and Anthony Albanese capturing the moment, seizing on the times, and having an agenda to match.
Do you think, you have compared it with 1945. It is different, but the thing about Chifley and Playford were they were talking about a big role for government.
Yes.
And we seem to be frightened of saying big role for government in Australia these days.
Well, not after the pandemic. I mean, we've never had a bigger role for government. And what we saw as Australians, in a way that we haven't seen for decades, Laura, invest their confidence in governments. And let's be honest, there's been challenges, but over the last 2 years, it's served us pretty well as a nation. Like our federation has largely worked. Like we largely responded to a crisis with an extraordinary degree of success across the political divide. So while there's the pitfalls and challenges, and while COVID has exacerbated some of our economic challenge, in terms of the operation of government and people's willingness to put faith in government, that occurred. It's an investment that has largely paid off, and I think that's why the electorate are now looking to the future and saying, right, let's do it again. But let's get a bigger long-term return. Let's not just worry about saving lives tomorrow. Let's talk about setting lives up for the next generation.
Our final question is from Gabriel Polikonis.
Gabriel Polikonis from The Advertiser again. I know I'm up against the clock, so I'll make it quick. On nuclear-powered submarines, do you think that it should be built in South Australia, and is that going to involve an expansion of the nuclear industry, and what will you do to make that happen?
Well, clearly there will be the short answer to your first question is yes, we want these submarines built in South Australia. I think we've gone on one extraordinary journey to get to this point, and we're only in an 18-month review now, so $5.5 billion. That's a lot of money spent on literally nothing now, apart from delay. But nonetheless, yes, the submarines should be built in South Australia. That will require a functioning industry that will support the building of nuclear submarines. I think we should be actively ambitious about that and make sure that the engagement in the nuclear industry in South Australia is consistent with our capability and skills, where we've got a lot of work to do.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank the South Australian Premier.